Story number 1, The Stranger in the Shadows. It had been months since my breakup with Sarah, and I was finally starting to feel like myself again. We'd been together for 3 years, and even though I knew the relationship wasn't working, the loneliness still hit hard. To cope, I threw myself into my hobbies, one of which was photography. I loved capturing the city at night, the way the lights reflected off the wet pavement, the quiet hum of life after dark. It was therapeutic in a way. One Friday night, I decided to head downtown to shoot some long exposure shots of the skyline. I packed my camera, tripod, and a thermos of coffee, then drove to my favorite spot, a secluded parking garage with a perfect view of the city. It was around 11 p.m. when I arrived, and the garage was eerily empty. I didn't think much of it. I was used to being alone in places like this. I set up my gear on the top floor and started taking photos. The night was calm, the air crisp, and for the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. But that peace didn't last long. About an hour into my shoot, I noticed a car pull into the garage. It was an old, beat-up sedan, and it parked a few spaces away from me. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone else had the same idea as me. But then the driver just sat there, engine idling, headlights off. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my camera, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After a few minutes, the car door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, and he just stood there staring at me. My heart started racing, but I told myself to stay calm. Maybe he was just curious about what I was doing. I waved awkwardly, hoping he'd leave me alone, but he didn't. Instead, he started walking toward me. I quickly packed up my gear, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the tripod. By the time I was done, he was only a few feet away. "Nice night for photos," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just getting some shots of the skyline." He nodded, but his eyes never left mine. There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. I slung my camera bag over my shoulder and started walking toward my car, but he followed. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "It's not safe." I didn't respond. I just quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached my car, I threw my gear into the back seat and jumped in, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, watching me drive away. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. The next night, I was at home editing the photos I'd taken when I heard a knock at my door. It was late, almost midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I peered through the peephole and froze. It was him, the man from the garage. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. How did he know where I lived? I didn't call the police. I don't know why. Maybe I was in shock. Instead, I turned off all the lights and waited, hoping he'd leave. He didn't. For hours, I heard him pacing outside my apartment, muttering to himself. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun finally rose, I looked out the window and saw him walking away, disappearing into the morning fog. I never saw him again, but I still think about that night. I still wonder what he wanted and what might have happened if I'd opened the door. Story number 2, The Uninvited Guest. I've always been a light sleeper. The slightest noise can wake me up, and once I'm awake, it's hard to fall back asleep. So when I heard the sound of footsteps in my living room one night, I knew something was wrong. It was around 2 a.m., and I was alone in my apartment. I lay in bed listening, hoping it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of someone walking across the hardwood floor. My heart started racing, and I reached for my phone, ready to call the police. But before I could dial, the footsteps stopped. Everything went silent. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear any sound. Minutes passed, and just when I started to think I'd imagined it, I heard a voice. "I know you're awake." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my mind racing. Who was in my apartment, and how did they get in? I didn't respond. I just lay there, paralyzed with fear, hoping they'd leave, but they didn't. The footsteps started again, this time coming closer. I could hear them moving down the hallway toward my bedroom. I clutched my phone tighter, my finger hovering over the call button, but I was too scared to move. The door creaked open, and I saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. I couldn't make out their face, but I could feel their eyes on me. "Don't be afraid," the voice said. "I just want to talk." I didn't believe them. I couldn't. My instincts screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something, but I was frozen. The figure stepped into the room, and that's when I finally found the courage to act. I screamed, loud and piercing, and lunged for the lamp on my nightstand. I swung it at the figure, but they dodged it easily, laughing as they backed away. "You're feisty," they said. "I like that." I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted out of bed and ran for the door, but they grabbed me before I could reach it. I fought with everything I had, kicking and screaming, until I finally broke free. I ran out of the apartment and didn't stop until I reached the street. I called the police from a neighbor's house, but by the time they arrived, the intruder was gone. They never found out who it was or how they got in. To this day, I still don't know what they wanted or why they chose me. Story number 3. The Silent Couple. I work as a bartender at a small, cozy pub in the heart of the city. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the regulars are like family. But one night, everything changed. It was a slow Tuesday evening, and the pub was nearly empty. I was wiping down the bar when the door opened, and a couple walked in. They were older, maybe in their 70s, and they looked out of place. They sat down at a table in the corner, and I went over to take their order. But when I approached, they didn't say a word. They just stared at me, their eyes cold and empty. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe they were shy or hard of hearing. I asked again, louder this time, but they still didn't respond. I left them alone, figuring they'd signal me when they were ready to order. But they never did. Hours passed and they just sat there, silent and unmoving. The other customers started to notice, and the atmosphere in the pub grew tense. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to their table and asked if they needed anything. The man looked up at me, his eyes piercing, and said, "We're waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, but he didn't answer. I decided to ignore them after that, hoping they'd leave on their own. But they didn't. They stayed until closing time, just sitting there staring at nothing. When it was time to lock up, I told them they had to leave. The woman turned to me, her face expressionless, and said, "We'll see you again." I didn't know what to say. I just watched as they got up and walked out, disappearing into the night. The next day, I asked my coworkers if they'd seen the couple, but no one remembered them. They said the pub had been empty all night. I never saw the couple again, but I still think about them. I still wonder what they were waiting for and why they chose me.